First Person Peculiar by T.L. Sherred. So this is a pretty peculiar book. The title is First Person Peculiar, and the tagline is, "How first can a peculiar person get?" And we have some very interesting cover art here by John Holmes. Now, this is a collection of short stories that was published here by Ballantine in 1972. It's the only publication of this collection. There's no hardbacks or anything like that. And it's a collection of 4 short stories, like I said. And there's a list of the stories. They were published between 1947 and 1954. And they were published in various magazines that were listed there. But the most notable story in this collection, E for Effort, was also put into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 2B. Now, besides these 4 short stories, T.L. Sherred only wrote 3 others. Probably the most popular besides this one was a story he wrote for Again, Dangerous Visions by Harlan Ellison. And that's really where you can find the most information out about Sherred. There's an introduction by Ellison, and then there's a foreword and an afterwards by Sherred. And he talks a little bit about his life. Ellison talks about really wanting to get him to write a story for that anthology. And, you know, he was just kind of a regular guy. He only wrote when he needed to. He lived in Detroit. He worked for the automotive industry. And he wrote 7 short stories, and then he wrote this one novel called Alien Island in 1970. He also had a draft for a sequel to this one, but he never finished it before he passed away. But Lloyd Biggle Jr. ended up writing the sequel, and that one was called Alien Maine. So he wrote very little, very obscure guy. But man, he could write some really great stories. So I recently did a video about Barry Malzberg recommending 10 short stories, and I'll post a link to that video down in the description. But one of the stories that Malzberg recommended was E for Effort, which is in this collection. And I read that one and completely loved it, and so I had to read the other 3 in this collection. Now, the first one that I'm going to talk about was probably my least favorite. And it was quite a bit different than the other 3. And it was also the shortest in the bunch. And I think it was like 40 pages. And it was called Cure Guaranteed. And this is a story about a private investigator who works for a doctor. And he goes around and helps kind of close down some of these shady doctor's offices that are opening around his town. And he gets tipped off in the beginning of the story that there's this new place that's opening up, and they claim they can cure the common cold. And he and his wife go down there to investigate this. And I found the magazine that this was originally published in, and this is kind of a depiction of how they cure the common cold. They bring you in, they have you stripped down completely naked. You're in there alone. They had boxer shorts on our main character here in the cover for understandable reasons. But you just stand there and there's this buzzing that happens around your head, and then you're cured. So our doctor is very skeptical that this works. They end up talking to the person in charge, who is very clear that he's not a doctor. He ends up being we find out he's an aeronautical engineer. And so this kind of creates some conflict between this office that's opening. It's actually curing people. It's getting busier and busier. Our doctor feels like this is a threat to his practice. And our private investigator is kind of thrown in the middle of this, and he's trying to figure out a way to make everyone happy. This one was pretty lighthearted. It kind of had a silly punchline or ending to it. But it was still really good, and it's definitely worth reading if you find this collection. So the other 3 stories in this collection all kind of had the same setup and theme in a way. It's hard not to read these 3 stories and not think that T.L. Sherred had some sort of mistrust for authority, because it's a common thing that comes up in these. I know authors can just fabricate these things for the sake of the plot and to create conflict and all of that. And I usually give the author the benefit of the doubt, but I have a sneaking suspicion that Sherred was putting some of his own ideas into these next 3 stories. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called Eye for Iniquity. And this is a story about a man who realizes he can start duplicating things. And he's duplicating money, trying to provide for his family, but he quickly catches wind that the local businesses are on the lookout for these $10 bills that all have the same serial number. And he realizes he was being kind of sloppy, and so he starts mixing up the way he was doing this and going to a bunch of different stores to use this money and to try to spread it out a little bit so he doesn't get caught. And it ends up working. He ends up providing for his family, even to the point where he buys a house in this new neighborhood. And in this new neighborhood, one of his neighbors approaches him at one point and says, "Hey, I work for the IRS. I just want to warn you, they want to meet with you." And so this is kind of where the fun starts. He basically gets interrogated by the IRS. And this one had a sort of more lighthearted, less cynical ending than the rest of them. But it was really interesting the way he crafted this story and finished it up. And it was good, but the next 2 were really good. So the next one I talk about is called Q for Quiet. And I want to warn you, if you read that story in this collection, it's missing something. I'll get to that at the end. And there's a place that's real easy to find, and you can get this last section that was missing out of this story for some reason, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this is a story about a guy who realizes he can stop electronic devices. At first, he's just hanging out in his local bar, having a good time. He's annoyed that the jukebox is too loud, and all of a sudden it starts smoking and all the electronics kind of get fried in it. He kind of gets into a similar situation here and there, and then realizes he could be the cause of this, and he starts testing this ability out. And it seems it works on all electronic devices and even motors. And at one point he gets kind of cut off by this vehicle, and he thinks ill thoughts about it, and the motor stops running in this vehicle. He knows this is a very powerful ability. He's trying to use it sparingly, but he ends up getting found out. He gets pulled in fairly aggressively. Him and his wife, they get separated, and he gets interrogated by these authorities. At first, it seems like it's just the police, but it turns out it's also the military who's involved in this. And he keeps getting investigated and interrogated all the way up to the President of the United States of America. And they're using him like he's not a real person, or they're talking about him, stripping away his humanity in a way, and never really thinking of him as a human. They're thinking of him as a tool. And Sherred writes that part into the story real well. Our main character is very upset that he's being treated this way. He has this very sarcastic personality that is very humorous through the whole short story. And that part of it was what kept me going through this whole thing. It was the longest of the bunch here. I think it was around 80 pages. And, these authorities, they just don't know what to do with him, because this is such a powerful ability. They're looking at the implications of using this in war. And they're also thinking about how this could be used against him. And is this isolated to just this one person, or is this an ability that they could teach other people? And could this be the future of modern warfare? This one was done really well. I love this one almost as much as the last one that I'm going to talk about. And when I got to the end of the book, into the end of the short story in this collection, I was thinking, that was really, really good. And then I was doing some research afterwards, and I found out that this particular short story, Q for Quiet, is available on Project Gutenberg. I pulled it down and I was looking at it, and this is like the way it was published originally in the magazine. So there's all these illustrations throughout it. It's pretty cool. And I was checking out all the illustrations, and I got down to the end, and I noticed there was a memo, and I read the memo, and I was like, there it is. That's what I was waiting for. I went back and looked, and it's not in here for some reason. Either they left it out intentionally or somehow missed it. But if you read that story in this collection, you got to go to Project Gutenberg, download that file, scroll to the end, and read the memo. It kind of finishes the story in a way that I think it's a bit missing if you don't have that. So that's a tip. You got to do that. Now, the last story I'm going to talk about, it's the story that Malzberg recommended in that video I did. It was called E for Effort, and it was phenomenal. This is a story about a guy who he's writing this story like it's a correspondence to some unknown person. You don't know, you never really find out who this person is until later, and it plays into the plot and the setup of this thing. But at first you're just reading it like it's just some correspondence. And our main character is talking about waiting for a bus and seeing that some guy was showing these short films, so he decided to go check them out. He knew a little bit about film, and he was amazed by the quality of these short little silent films. And so afterwards, he's talking to the filmmaker. They end up having a couple beers. He's trying to give him some pointers how he can make these films better. And the filmmaker shows him how he's doing this. And he has this device called a time viewer. And it can go backwards in time to any period. It can go anywhere on the earth and find scenes of real life events that were happening, and it can record them. So he was actually going back and recording these scenes and showing them to people. And so our main character decides to kind of form a partnership with this guy, and they at first just they go back and find some things to blackmail some important people of their modern times and get enough money to where they can open up, or they rent this building so they can start making these films. And when they go back and record these scenes, they don't get any audio, so they come up with these really detailed scripts. Some of the first videos or movies were set in the Roman times, and they use the time viewer to record the scenes. And then they make this script of how they want some voice actors to come back over and voice these films. They take them to Hollywood, and the people there are wowed by them. They instantly sell them. They hire some voice actors. They release it onto the market, and it's like an instant success. They do this a few times and really gain some worldwide notoriety for how well their films are until they release their final masterpiece. Their final masterpiece kind of sets the world in a bit of a chaotic state, and they end up getting pulled into like a court situation where they're basically interrogated and have to kind of get through this situation that they put themselves into. This one was just really well done. The plot, the ideas, the characters, what their ultimate motives and goals were was just done so well. And I don't really want to talk too much about the ending to give away any kind of emotional reaction or feeling, but this one took me by surprise a couple times, and that one was my favorite in this whole collection. So, I don't hear anybody really talking about T.L. Sherred. He didn't write very much, but if you ever run across this collection, you got to pick it up. Check out some of his short stories. I know you could probably find some of these online, but he's definitely worth the read, and I want to kind of hopefully drag him out of obscurity a little bit because he was doing things a little differently for his time, maybe a little ahead of his times in certain aspects, and he's definitely worth checking out. So that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.